Good morning, everyone. It is 9 a.m., so we will begin with our press conference for the 10 new insights in climate science. Thank you to everyone who's joined us. We will have a presentation for about 20 to 30 minutes. Then we will have question and answer session for journalists. If you have a question, you can raise your hand and we will unmute you and call upon you and allow you to ask your question. You can also write it in the chat function and leave it there. If you have a specific person you want to direct your question to, please let us know. Otherwise, we'll leave it open to our speakers to respond as they see fit. So without further ado, I'm going to pass it off to Professor Peter Schlosser, who will take us from there. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Good afternoon, or good morning, good evening. Welcome, and thank you for attending today's press briefing on what is the most pressing climate science ahead of the Conference of Parties 29, COP29. And we are talking about the 10 new insights in climate science. I'm Peter Schlosser, Vice President and Vice Provost of Global Futures and Director of the Julian Wrigley Global Futures Laboratory at Arizona State University. I'm also co-chair of the Earth League. The 10 New Insights report is organized and produced in collaboration between Future Earth, the Earth League, and the World Climate Research Program. I am joined by leading climate scientists, including Professor Johan Rockström, who is the director of the Potsdam Institute for Climate Impact Research and co-chair of the Earth League. Dr. Jamila Mahmood, the executive director of the Sunway Center for Planetary Health. Dr. Josep Pep Canadell, who is the chief research scientist at the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organization, and Professor Jayashree Roy from the Asian Institute of Technology. The 2024 10 New Insights in Climate Science report urges policymakers at COP29 to reflect on these insights when they are updating the submissions of their nationally determined contributions, also known as the NDCs, that are due in early 2025, and hopefully drive their attention to them within the negotiations, including on the pivotal issues of climate finance. This report is published amid surging global temperatures that are making our planet increasingly uninhabitable by, for example, disrupting our ocean's vital planetary processes, pushing the Amazon to the brink of large-scale collapse, and threatening an unborn generation by heightening chances of health complications such as, for example, pregnancy complications and even loss. We just have seen one of these consequences of the surging global temperatures and consequently more extremes that we are seeing when we witnessed Hurricane Helene destroying Asheville, a city in the US, in North Carolina, of about 500,000 people. And we are seeing that more and more frequently. This is no longer an abstract finding. This is something that has a human face, and it will face more and more people. So it is really urgent to take action and to look at what we know about, from the climate science perspective, about what is happening right now and what is ahead of us. I will now hand over to Johan Rockström, who will take you through the main findings of the report.
Yeah, thanks, Peter, and hello, everyone. So, as Peter says, I think in summary, the 2024 NICS, as we call it, the New Insights in Climate Science, provides a scientific update of the dire state of the planet and the urgency to mitigate, adapt, and particularly to invest in building resilience in social and ecological systems to face the inevitable rising climate-induced extreme events that we not only are experiencing today, but will inevitably experience in the decades to come. I will here summarize 3 of the more diagnostic insights. We then will be followed by digging into the scientific updates on the investment space, both for health and social and ecological resilience building. Insight 5 is the one that confirms the fact that we are very worried in the scientific community today that we're seeing an accelerated warming rate globally, starting from 2014, meaning over the last 10 years, which we cannot fully explain. But in this 10 nicks, we summarize and conclude that the future warming, as far as we have been able to analyze it so far, might be underestimated by current climate models due to different biases. Assumptions of stable carbon uptake, for example, on land, ocean stability, stable and predictable El Nino frequency and strength, and no tipping points. We also lack still the challenge of having short observational records. Closing these gaps are crucial for improving predictions, conducting more robust risk assessments, and developing more effective adaptation strategies. But the fundamental is that we have enough science for urgent action, but we're still at a state where our conclusion is that we've underestimated risk. The unprecedented ocean warming, for example, since 2023, has broken sea surface temperatures well beyond anything expected, a sudden 0.2 degrees Celsius jump. This increased scientific concerns about the potential consequences in large-scale processes in ocean and ocean-atmosphere interactions. As Peter pointed out, for example, are we seeing a destabilization or a change in the El Nino Southern Oscillation cycling, potentially leading to more extreme El Nino events, meaning more floods, droughts, heat waves, and fires, and that we can no longer exclude that the Atlantic meridional overturning circulation, the AMOC, may be threatened also in its stability. The economic impacts of El Nino frequency and impacts are also more severe, according to the summary of this 10 nicks than previously understood, with global income losses from past events adding up to trillions of US dollars. Moreover, the projected additional economic losses due to increased El Nino frequency and intensity from global warming could be, we conclude, as high as 80 trillion US dollars over the 21st century. So these are all indications of underestimating pace of change. Insight 3, which is a really worrying one, which is very much on the agenda today, is human threatening heat impacts, which are now making more and more places on Earth uninhabitable across the entire planet. So rising heat, and particularly the combination with humidity due to climate change, is pushing more people outside of the climate conditions adapted for human life. The estimates are now up to 600 million people living outside of the habitable climatic conditions. And with each 1 degree Celsius of warming, our scientific understanding today is that an estimated 10% more people, citizens in the world, will join them. Some regions, concentrated particularly in the global south, are more exposed to extreme heat and humidity than others. These populations also tend to lack adaptive capacity, like air conditioning and proper shading, to support continued habitability. This poses a tremendous and very, very risky combination. Heat action plans and early warning systems will become increasingly important as a preparedness strategy, also for social stability for countries across the most affected regions. Protecting particularly vulnerable groups, outdoor workers, elderly, pregnant women, children, will require specific measures. And then finally, the third diagnostic insight, insight 6, on diversity and the urgent need to build resilience in the Amazon rainforest against climate change. We have ample evidence today that the Amazon basin is under increasing pressure from climate change, deforestation, and biodiversity loss. These drivers interact, which means that we tend to underestimate, for example, the tolerance of the Amazon rainforest to just global warming, because we're not able fully to factor in the loss of resilience when we lose biodiversity. And today, the entire system is losing resilience. Some areas have already tipped over from carbon sink to carbon source. And we're talking of planet Earth's richest biodiverse terrestrial ecosystem on land. And there's growing concern about the future disruption of water recycling at the region. Remember, 40% of the rainfall in the rainforest region is recycled land to land. Both of these processes have far-reaching consequences for people at the local and regional scale, and amplifying global warming, affecting us all across the entire planet. The conclusion is that the Amazon rainforest is approaching multiple thresholds related to temperature, rainfall, and seasonality caused by climate change and deforestation, beyond which significant ecological changes can be triggered, potentially leading to large-scale forest collapse. The Amazon is a global common that all citizens in the world depend on for the stability of the climate system. Mitigation is urgent, but equally important, and that is our key message on this insight this year, is equally important, is to protect standing forests and biodiversity in order to build as much resilience as possible in the face of the rapidly rising stress due to climate change-induced extreme droughts, fires, and heat. With that, back to you, Peter.
Thank you, Johan. We will now turn to Jamila Mahmood, who will talk about insight number 4.
Thank you very much, and hello, everyone. When we talk about climate change, we often focus on rising seas and extreme weather. But today, I want to highlight something that Johan raised earlier, a critical yet often overlooked impact, that is the growing threat to maternal and reproductive health. The progress we have made in protecting mothers and newborns over recent decades is now at risk due to our changing climate. Let me share some stark numbers that illustrates this crisis. In one study spanning 33 countries across 3 continents in the global south, from South America, Asia, and Africa, researchers estimated that floods alone may cause over 107,000 pregnancy losses each year. The impact extends far beyond flooding. In India, researchers found that when pregnant women are exposed to occupational heat and stress, which affects nearly half of working pregnant women, their risk of miscarriage doubles. The effect of heat exposure are particularly well documented. In Southern California, researchers revealed significant associations between long-term heat exposure and serious birth complications, including stillbirths and preterm or premature births. Heat exposure has been linked to maternal hypertensive disorders, including preeclampsia and gestational diabetes. And the cascade of impacts continues after birth. Increased heat can reduce the availability of food and water, forcing new mothers to travel longer distances in dangerous temperatures, compromising their postpartum recovery. The nutritional impacts are also concerning. Climate-driven food insecurity leads to inadequate nutrition during pregnancy, resulting in low birth weights and reduced breast milk production. And these behavioral adaptations that follow the extreme heat are also very troubling. Studies have documented declines in breastfeeding frequency, reduced travel for medical care, and lower use of protective measures like mosquito nets. These aren't just statistics. They represent real mothers and families bearing the brunt of our changing climate, with consequences that can span generations. But here is what should truly shake us to our core. The impact goes beyond direct exposure to climate and extreme weather. Climate change creates a cascade of risks for maternal health. When food and water become scarce, new mothers must travel further. When communities are displaced by disasters related to climate change, women lose access to essential health care. In fact, research in 3 South Asian countries revealed that just 1 degree centigrade rise in annual mean temperature is associated with 4.5% increase in intimate partner violence. I think what makes it more stark is the rising inequalities that actually exemplify and augment these pressing challenges to women of color, those with lower incomes, and those with lower education are at greatest risk. So traditional gender roles are often are often force pregnant women to continue dangerous work like collecting wood or water during extreme heat waves. And despite these severe impacts, our response has been inadequate. Only 27 out of 119 countries, I repeat, 27 out of 119 countries even mention maternal and sexual reproductive health in their climate commitments in the nationally determined contributions. Our healthcare systems globally are underprepared in these mounting challenges. And the solution is not just about climate mitigation or adaptation. We need to strengthen women's decision-making power in climate policy, which means investing in their education, increasing their participation in policy formulation. And we need to integrate maternal health protection in our climate response to avoid losing the good progress in maternal and child mortality. And we need to recognize that protecting maternal health in a changing climate is not just a medical issue. It is a fundamental matter of gender equity and climate justice. So the time to act is now. We cannot allow climate change to erase decades of progress in maternal health, and every day we delay, more mothers and newborns are put at risk. Thank you.
Thank you, Jamila. Joseph Canadell will now highlight findings in insights number 1 and 2.
Thank you. So I'll begin speaking about methane, and there's been a massive shift of interest on methane, particularly coming from the fact that more than 120 countries signed the Global Methane Pledge to reduce 30% emissions by 2030. Also, and kind of a new discover understanding of the potential that mitigation of methane has in almost immediate warming, and therefore the great potential benefits above and beyond other greenhouse gases. The largest anthropogenic source is actually agriculture and fossil fuel, both of them. Agriculture is still even bigger than fossil fuels. And that has been one of the reasons why perhaps in the past we have spoken a little less about it, because it was associated with food production and food security. I think that it has changed quite dramatically, in part because methane emissions have continued to increase nonstop, for decades. And we've seen over the last few years, particularly 2020, 2022, a rapid accumulation of methane in the atmosphere in ways that we had not seen in the past, and almost above and beyond the growth due to anthropogenic emissions, which is where we have the biggest and more direct control. So what we saw is in these particular years, 2020, 2022, was that wetlands around the world, they all increase quite dramatically and fast, the emissions, methane emissions. And the reasons were, number one, because we were breaking some of the top records of global warming. At the same time, we were going through these very unprecedented 3 consecutive years of La Nina, where the tropics receive more water, and where we saw the biggest increase in methane. So we have now an anthropogenic issue, and then we have an indirect problem which goes through the global warming on the natural world, particularly on wetlands, and particularly wetlands in the tropics. We also, the last couple of years has been quite important. Global Carbon Project of Future Earth has also shown that of all methane emissions, the fraction due to human activities is at least 2/3, which is a very significant increase from previous assessments, and fundamentally showing the bigger challenge we have in addressing that component, but also, of course, more opportunities. And those additional emissions are come from a better understanding of the anthropogenic emissions from fresh waters, anything that has to do with rivers, lakes, ponds, all the way to the coastal zones, which before we knew very little about it. There are many opportunities for mitigation. I won't talk much about it here, but the biggest ones, of course, are on the fugitive emissions from the oil and gas industries. Many of them, can be fixed very quickly with existing technologies, and certainly even at no cost or very little cost, just because the major savings of a very valuable commodity that gets lost, through leaks. And there's many other opportunities in landfills, rice paddies. I'm happy to talk and entertain some specific questions. And the harder one certainly is the livestock, reducing emissions. And there's a really powerful research and development agenda that needs to continue over the coming years to really bring the kind of solutions that we need. On the aerosols front, aerosols are very interesting substances, of course, components. They have a massive human health issue in terms of human health, but they also cool the climate. They cool the climate because they reflect radiation back to space. So basically they hide what's potential it's warming based on the greenhouse we emit. And the big issue is that as we clean aerosols, through more stringent pollution policies. At the same time, we move away from the combustion of fossil fuels. We're unmasking, quite a lot of warming that already existed there, but was not felt, by us. We are already detecting this global decline in emissions through some of the satellite measurements we have. And although we have big uncertainties still, we measure almost anywhere between 15 and 50% emission reduction. I'm sorry, warming reduction from warming additional from that reduction of aerosol emissions that will be equivalent to what the CO2, the single most important greenhouse gases, has been doing. So a very significant amount of warming, coming from these declining aerosols. Now we already detect this thing quite dramatically, both on road traffic, power generation, particularly on coal power plants, which globally they still have increased, but in more regions than less. Coal power plants are declining very quickly, and that has led an immediate benefit on the reductions of aerosols. Having said that, of course, we have regions around the world, both in South Asia and South America, which aerosols continue to increase, and the future of Africa is a little more uncertain. We've seen also really interesting declines in some of the ocean shipping routes after the International Maritime Organization put in place very stringent regulations for sulfur content of the bunkers. Bunkers are the dirtiest type of fossil fuel that we use, to power any machines. And so we are already detecting, a very clear kind of increased warming, due to those rapid decreasing aerosols. So just to make clear, this aerosol warming masking is part of our models already. So it's not that we didn't know this thing, or that all of a sudden now we think that we have much more warming. The important new science over the last few years is that we think that, if anything, we're underestimating that warming effect of reducing aerosols, which basically means that it is likely that we might have a much stronger feedbacks and accelerate warming in the future as we continue, and as we should, of course, continue to decrease these aerosols. So in summary, there's no doubt that we have already feeling large benefits of health benefits of this reduction of aerosols, and that we are already detectively unmasking the warming that was hidden away from us, and that future unmasking can actually potentially be a little even bigger than what we are currently doing with our models, or predicting with our models, which just adds to the urgency at which greenhouse emissions need to be reduced. Thank you.
Thank you, Pep. We will now hear from Joshri Roy about the major findings of insights number 9 and 10.
Thank you, Peter. In insight number 9 in this report, what it brings forth is that for low carbon development, few minerals and metals are essential, such as cobalt, copper, lithium, and rare earth elements, which we call ETMs. So how governance mechanism across the value chain of energy transition minerals must be people-centered and planetary justice-centered to avoid greater burdens and fewer benefits for Global South countries. By 2050, the world demand for these energy transition minerals are expected to surpass the globally known reserves. For example, by 2050, annual lithium demand could exceed 25% of known reserves. Similarly for rare earth elements. Also, we need to remember all these minerals can generate enormous amounts of waste. The extraction of copper, nickel, manganese, and lithium alone could produce 953 gigatons of dry waste over the 2020 and 2050 period. Now, we also know the science is clear that Global North dominates over high value added production and consumption, while Global South has the resource wealth. So, for example, while cobalt mining is concentrated in the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC-owned companies control less than 5% of production. And 69% of over 5,000 global ETM projects are located on or near land classified as indigenous peoples or peasants' land. So the disparities in trade policies, technological capacity, and economic diversification hindered the Global South's ability to fully benefit from the energy transition. So this insight has huge policy implication. We know all that COP28 made the announcement of the UN panel on critical energy transition minerals, but it is important to ensure that the extraction and processing of critical minerals is done in a sustainable, fair, and just way. COP29 is expected to play a crucial role in shaping the global approach for the governance of energy transition minerals. So the current voluntary standards and regulations are often uncoordinated and insufficient, and involvement of civil society remain limited. So comprehensive global governance mechanisms need to balance geopolitical interests, harmonize trade, planetary justice, and climate policies. Now, Insight 9 writes about how perception of fairness influence the acceptance of climate policies. Policymaking in every country must be inclusive and carefully navigate a variety of socioeconomic factors. Perception of unfairness give rise to resistance and in some cases contributing to civil unrest. People are wary of unfairly bearing additional economic costs. New taxes and removal of subsidies often face resistance, but if the revenue or public savings are used for improving well-being or reducing inequality or even for environmental measures, the measures can become more acceptable. 40% of the world is already highly vulnerable to the ever-increasing rising temperature. So the climate transition often overlooks local needs and aspirations that will cause short-term costs for some groups. Planned relocation are an example of adaptation measures that can face strong resistance, especially when introduced without attention to the effect on social networks and the livelihoods. Resistance is not inherently negative. It can provide a political voice to marginalized groups that lack the power to influence policy through democratic means. So the global studies show that nearly 70% of people are willing to allocate 1% of their income to climate action. And almost 90% of these people want more government efforts. So success depends on policymakers balancing social and industrial interests while considering specific socioeconomic fragilities derived from past economic and political reforms. The insight has very high policy implication, like how to encourage such as climate citizen assemblies involving experts and diverse stakeholders, and can increase all these can increase the legitimacy and acceptability of climate policies. Visible actions from the governments to combat corruption and regulatory capture contribute to raising perceptions of a fairer and more transparent environment. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We'll now go over to our question and answer session. We already have 2 questions in the chat. And again, if you have a question, please raise your hand and we'll call upon you and allow you to ask it. But we'll start with the first question to Professor Mahmood. It comes from Tim Stickings at the National in the UAE. And he asks, are there particular regions in the world where the risks to maternal health are especially high? For example, climate vulnerable areas or areas of heat stress?
Thank you. That's a really important question. I think there are several factors that will influence this. Firstly, what is the state of maternal and reproductive health in that particular place first? So you will imagine that the least developed countries that have less favorable situations for proper antenatal care and maternal and reproductive health care, who are already at risk, will be doubly impacted with climate change. And because climate change is happening across the globe, you will see that the vulnerable populations will become even more vulnerable. So I think that would be the approach that we take. So vulnerability is a critical factor.
Thank you very much. We have another question from Bernard Potter, and he asks one general question. Do you have the impression that the policymakers and delegates at COP29 are up to the state of science of climate change? That question is not directed towards anyone in particular. If it is, Bernard, please let us know. Otherwise, I open it to the floor.
Yeah, Frank, I can just start. I really hope that those assembled here, journalists, get the red thread throughout these presentations, which is that we in the scientific community simply have to admit that despite all the scientific advancements, and again, there's so much science that there's absolutely no excuse to act in an accelerated way, both on mitigation and adaptation. But we must admit that very likely we have underestimated the pace of change, and that we have an even larger challenge when we add in the aerosols, the methane, the accelerated warming, the observations we see in the ocean, the accelerated temperature rise in the atmosphere. There is early signs of an Earth system which seems to be gradually losing its own inbuilt biogeophysical resilience, which of course is something that we in the scientific community, and that's why we have the 10 new insights in climate science, argue very strongly that the negotiators at the COP meetings must be informed of. And is it likely that they are fully up to speed with this? And the answer is, in my view, that they're not. They're not even living up to the quite optimistic IPCC AR6 assessments from 2021, which itself are, requiring that the world cut global emissions by 42% by 2030, reduce emissions by 7.5% per year, reach a net zero world economy by 2050. That is what the Paris Climate Agreement states. That's what the Dubai Agreement states. And here comes the latest scientific updates showing that, if anything, we may have even underestimated and been too optimistic with regards to our analysis, that we have to go even faster. So, I'm personally very concerned here, and I think the 10 NICs are important to hand over to all the climate negotiators so that they are updated with the latest science.
I see I have a hand from Joyashree and Peter. So Joyashree, if you want to jump in, and then to Peter to answer that question.
Yes, what I wanted to say is that oftentimes we hear from the policymakers that there is not citizens preparedness, but then when we reviewed this scientific literature, we found that actually 90% believe that it's the government who need to take action, and they are also ready to share some of the costs, right? At least 1% they can share. So this is something that we usually say that society is not prepared. That's sometimes not really true. And this report clearly shows if the policymaker want to do. And now I think in COP28, there is a mandate that they need to design policies for just transition for the energy transition materials. And this report clearly shows that, okay, what are the loopholes in the existing mechanism which are there happening in an uncoordinated way, and what can be done more. So basically emphasizing how sustainable sourcing, recycling, and circular economy can be implemented. So these are actually going to advance the economy. So policymaker, I think, need to be really going through this very short report with clear kind of recommendations, and also what they can do. So I feel that it's the communication that really matters now, that how we can take the actions. It's already late, but we cannot delay any further. The message really needs to go out.
Peter, did you want to add really quickly? Otherwise,
just very quickly. If I understand the question correctly, it asked if the negotiators at COP29 are actually aware of the facts of climate change. And I expect that there is a granular picture, that some of them are more aware of the complex system that we are looking at and how it's perturbed and what can be done, and others are less. What I would hope is that everybody understands that we are deep in negative time compared to the Paris Accord. We fell behind in time, that has already been said by Johan and others, and that action is needed immediately. Now, that's where the 10 NICs are coming in, and where the way we communicate, as Joshua actually said right now, is important. We have more knowledge than is being used, and Johan already pointed that out. So bringing that across and making sure that more of the knowledge that we have is being translated into action, and how that can be done without sacrifice but with opportunity, I think that's the key to bring across, so that this action really moves forward without further delay. Because if we are going further into negative time, the planet will self-regulate, and that will not be a pretty picture. Thank you.
Thank you. I see Pep has a hand as well. You're looking to respond to this question?
Very quickly, just to say, I just want to echo everything that has been said, and I want to add that urgency is actually just the way forward. The urgency was already built in the Paris Agreement, and we're just showing that there's a few layers of urgency. So we know what we need to do, and it's just that we're just not doing fast enough. Thank you.
Thank you. Again, if you have any questions, please raise your hand and we'll call upon you. We have another question in the chat on insight number 10, and it says the report, and I'm sorry, it's from Florence Jones at the Financial Times. And she writes, the report mentions citizen assemblies as one method of involving more voices in climate policy design. Is there any other methods which policymakers could employ to allow marginalized voices to contribute? Joyeshra, do you want to take this one?
Yeah. I think there are many things. I'll just this report also mentions, say, for example, when there is a revenue generation from a tax policy or the subsidy removal policy, then how the revenue can be distributed to the people, who is going to get how much and for what reason. So this distributive policy, these are national policies, really need to be articulated well. Usually we do not, the policymakers do not articulate these well beforehand, and that's why the resistance comes. So I think this is extremely important. Also, this money can be invested for social protection for the vulnerable groups. And so these messages need to be communicated well by the policymaker to the people. So I think more inclusive and participatory policies, and these are, not very new. We are repeating from many through all the reports, but what this report brings forth is that some very identified actions which can be implemented immediately given the bottom-up requirement also from the society. So I think there are enough examples which we can make use of. Thank you very much.
Thank you. There's also a short follow-up question for you that says, on policy acceptance, do you find that this is made more complex with climate skepticism?
Okay, so this is a question that climate skepticism and this complex policy are two different tracks, because climate skepticism is about whether you are accepting the climate change which is happening due to the Anthropocene or human activities. But then these actions complexity simply shows that how we need to take a systemic approach so that we not only create a policy, but also create enough legitimacy. And legitimacy comes through institution building, empowering people, and also creating an ecosystem which helps the economy and the society to thrive and not suffer. So I think these two are very different issues, and they have different, I don't think these are connected that way. So I would consider that policy complexity, the more and more we identify and more we see what systemic approach can help, that will help the policymaker to think through the way out also.
Thank you. There was also a question to Johan in the chat. He's answered that partially in the chat. Johan, I don't know if you want to say out loud what you've written or build upon it.
Yeah, no, I thought I'd just quickly get it into the chat. I think two key issues. The question is what needs to be accomplished in Baku, and of course it is a finance COP, and we know that this is ultimately where it all starts from, to shift the $7 trillion per year in subsidies to fossil fuels into mechanisms that allow particularly rapidly developing economies in the global south to afford and get interest rates and get credworthiness so that they can invest in the green technologies and avoid investing particularly in coal-fired plants. So that is a number one. But then secondly, we are increasingly communicating also with the UNFCCC of the need for a COP reform, that we should celebrate the fact that after now almost 30 years, we have all, it's not perfect, but we have all the legally binding agreements required to solve the problem. The Paris Agreement, the Methane Agreement that Pep talked about earlier here. We have a deforestation agreement. We have loss and damage. We have Article 6. We even have the Dubai Agreement that all countries in the world signed, that we are now phasing out oil, coal, and gas, accelerating this decade and following science. So now is the time to shift over into a COP logic where we start reporting on progress, being held accountable, get money on the table, and share solutions, meaning sharing technologies. And this is something that I think is boiling increasingly in civil society, in science, across the board. And I think that should come up also in the discussions in Baku. I know that Simon Steele is well aware of these that need to start looking towards a more implementation-oriented phase.
Thank you for that. And we have a question from Carrie Cullinan at Health Policy Watch to Dr. Mahmood, asking to unpack why intimate partner violence increases as countries heat up.
Well, there's enough research now that shows the clear connection between extreme heat and an increase in intimate violence. And this is really about amplifying stress. When there's increased heat, there's stress, irritability, and aggression. These are all known factors for partner violence. And some of the, apart from the psychological stress, there is also increased heart rate, which is directly related to increased heat, and that, dehydration and so forth. So some even physical changes creates behavioral changes in human beings that will amplify aggression, and this is much more seen in hot weather. Also, because of the heat, many couples have lower coping mechanisms, and this is even more amplified when they don't have access to cooling and air conditioning and other methods to cool down. And on top of that, if they are from a lower income group, the need to cool their homes and their environments causes another financial stress. So this also with the fact that when with increased heat, there's also less socialization because of the stress. This can actually then lead to using violence as a means to cope.
Thank you for that. And we have a comment, not so much a question, but a comment that perhaps Pep would like to respond to from Scott Randall, who writes, as an air quality policymaker, I really appreciate the use of the term demasking here. This takes some pressure away from air quality mitigation being a fundamental climate problem. In short, demasking is very nice wordsmithing. I don't know if you have anything you would like to say to that, Pep, or?
Yeah, no, I would just say that yes, correct. And I think that I already mentioned that it's not that we didn't know about it. It's not that it's not part of our climate model. So that is really a demasking, because it's not that all of a sudden we just discover these new things. So we should kind of slow down greenhouse emission reductions. I think that it is true that new science shows some of the complexity of the aerosol interactions, particularly interactions with the formation of clouds and the temporal evolution of this demasking. And we think that, of course, our models are just probably not doing a perfect job, and that research, it's an area that needs to kind of go and further develop so that the large uncertainties that we have, they can just be narrowed down. But the fundamental problem has been always part of our mitigation scenarios. And understanding that, of course, these aerosols will come down as we do both. We're kind of reducing pollution because for the health of human health on one hand, on the other hand, just as an outcome of moving away from fossil fuel. So yeah, that's thanks for supporting the use of this demasking approach.
Okay, I don't see any more questions in the chat or any raised hands from
mine is up, actually.
attendees. We have Peter. Would you like to respond to that last question or last comment?
Just very quickly to the last comment. It is, of course, an interesting observation that if you decrease the air pollution, you are accelerating warming. But we cannot say we should not continue to decrease air pollution because of that. In essence, what that tells us is we have to accelerate our efforts in combating climate change by mitigation measures. It's just a call for more action rather than saying, slow down the cleanup of the atmosphere, because as Jamila can attest, there are lots of casualties due to polluted air. So we just have to be careful with these kind of findings, that they are not used or misused in the overall context of where our world is heading. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Again, if there are any final questions, please ask them now. I don't have anything left in the chat or any raised hands at the moment. We have about 10 minutes left, so if there's any more questions, please ask them now. Otherwise, the report is now live on the website. You can download and read it there. Thanks to our panelists for taking time today, and thanks to everyone attending and asking questions. This is also going to be recorded and uploaded to the website as soon as we can get it there. So if there aren't any final questions, I will say good day, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone who joined us. And thank you very much. We appreciate it.